Hello, friends. Pastor Ron. Hey, wanted to talk to you a little bit about fasting. There's a lot of spiritual practices and a lot of spiritual disciplines that will be very beneficial in our walk with God and to help us and sharpen us and to increase our devotion to the Lord. I want to talk to you about the idea of fasting and prayer. Jesus mentions them both together here in a story in Mark chapter 9. It's a really bad story in the sense of this father has this son who is in dire straits. It's just awful. He is trying to take his own life, the little boy is, and the man brings the young boy to the disciples so that maybe they can help him find a place of deliverance and freedom. But the disciples failed. They did their thing. They prayed. They spoke to the boy, spoke to the dad, all those kind of things, and it didn't work. It didn't work. And then Jesus shows up on the scene, and here's what Jesus says. He takes charge of the situation. And Jesus looks at him and says, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you?" And then in verse 23, Jesus looks at the dad and he says this. It's a famous verse. It's one of my favorites, actually. "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." And then the dad gives just a great response right here. He says this to Jesus. He says, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." All right, put a tab right there with faithless generation, the idea of if you believe, and the idea of unbelief. I believe Jesus is building up a teaching for us here. And then Jesus takes charge of the situation, cast out the deaf and dumb spirit out of the boy, and the boy is set free. The disciples were confused about it. Later on that day, they get with Jesus in a house and they ask him a great question. They say, "Lord, why could we not cast this thing out of this boy? Why couldn't we help this young man? What was going on? Why couldn't we do this? Why are we powerless in this situation?" And Jesus responds to them and says that this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Very interesting. This kind of what? Maybe this kind of darkness, this kind of evil spirit, this kind of bondage can only come out if you pray and fast. Now, what does he mean by that? I don't think there's power in prayer and fasting. The power is in the God that we're talking to and we're devoting ourselves to. The power is in God. So the power is not in the disciples and all of their practices. But here's what happens when you are devoted to the Lord in something like prayer and fasting. You draw closer to God and you begin to grow spiritually. You begin to become more like Christ. So that's part of it, that this kind of stronghold, this kind of dark situation can't be dealt with unless somebody is walking really close with God. Prayer and fasting would represent that. But let me go back to this other idea. Let me submit this to you. This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Jesus highlights several times through there the idea of unbelief. That was the problem. Their unbelief. And what if Jesus is teaching us right here that this kind of unbelief can only come out if you pray and if you fast? In other words, this kind of unbelief that sits down in our soul to where we don't believe God can do the thing in the situation, or maybe we don't believe that God can use us in a particular way in a particular situation, especially a chronic, dark situation like this. Jesus said, this kind of unbelief can only come out if you draw close to God, because something happens when you draw close to God. He comes close to you, James tells us, but also there's a power that is transmitted and transferred to us from God. And only a close relationship with Christ can cause this kind of unbelief that we have from time to time, can cause this kind of unbelief to be pushed out of our hearts. Remember, Jesus said, if you can believe, all things are possible to those who believe. Jesus is interested in making us, equipping us, making us able to handle these kind of difficult situations. Draw close to God and let him drive the unbelief right out of your heart, no matter what it might be. Now, remember, he's talking to disciples here about this idea of unbelief. He's not talking to the world. He's talking to disciples. So I pray that you'll draw close to God through prayer and fasting, maybe solitude and silence, other spiritual disciplines we can do, the scriptures certainly, most certainly, gathering and fellowshipping with other believers. Draw close to God and watch Him drive the unbelief right out of our hearts and make us strong in faith so that we can help those who come to us. Hey, may God bless you and keep you. Grace and peace.